Hi guys, it's Janice. Today we're going to read about Mr. Wrong. Whatever Mr. Wrong did was absolutely, totally, completely, utterly wrong. However hard he tried, he just couldn't do anything right. Just look at his house. Even the door is upside down. One fine morning, Mr. Wrong woke up. He hadn't slept very well because of the way he'd made his bed the day before. He jumped out of bed, fell over twice, put on his shoes on the wrong feet, went to the bathroom, tripping over the bath mat, squeezed out some toothpaste on the wrong side of the toothbrush, cleaned his teeth, ouch, and went downstairs. Bump, 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 bump. Not a very good start to the day. In fact, his usual wrong start to the day. In his kitchen, Mr. Wrong poured some milk onto his cornflakes, and he missed it. As he sat in his kitchen that fine morning, eating his dry cornflakes, he sighed. Oh dear, he thought. I do so wish that everything I do wasn't quite so absolutely, totally, completely, utterly wrong. He wanted to be right for once. So, after breakfast, he went for a walk in order to think about how he could solve his problem. It took him 10 minutes to get out of his house, because he kept trying to open his front door outwards instead of inwards. So, the door was supposed to be pulled, but he kept pushing and pushing and pushing. Could he open the door? Of course not. As he walked along, he passed the worm. Good morning, dog, he said. Is that a dog? No. The worm grinned a little smile. He was used to Mr. Wrong being how wrong he usually was. Then he met a postman. Good morning, Mr. Wrong, called the postman cheerfully. Good morning, doctor. Is that a doctor? No, that's a postman. Oh dear. He met old Mrs. Twinkle, who lived down the lane. Good morning, Mr. Wrong, she smiled. Good morning, Mr. Twinkle, replied Mr. Wrong. Oh dear, is she Mr. Twinkle? No, she's Mrs. Twinkle. And then he met somebody he'd never met before. Somebody who sort of looked like him, but didn't. Good morning, sir, said that somebody. Good morning, madam. Is that a madam? No, but Mr. Wrong was always wrong. I'm Mr. Wrong. I guessed that, replied the person. Well, I'm Mr. Right. Oh, wow, so Mr. Wrong met Mr. Right. Now tell me, he went on, why are you walking along looking so miserable and sad? Mr. Wrong replied, because I can't do anything right at all. In which case, said Mr. Right, which one's Mr. Right, which one's Mr. Wrong? You see, Mr. Wrong has his wrong shoes, right? Now, Mr. Right said, we'd better do something about it. Follow me. And off he set. And off set Mr. Wrong. In the opposite direction, Mr. Wrong should follow him, not walking in different direction. Mr. Right hurried back and turned him around. This way, he said. And they walked together to where Mr. Right lived. It was a house which somehow looked something like Mr. Wrong's house, but different. It looks like Mr. Wrong's house, but more right. You see, the door's in the right position, in the right direction. Mr. Right took Mr. Wrong into his living room. I think, he said, that the only way you were ever going to change is for you to come and live with me for a while, because I'm always right. If you live with me, maybe you will change too. You may end up being not quite so absolutely, totally, completely, utterly wrong about everything. He said, "Sit down and we'll talk about it." Mr. Wrong sat down, but he missed the chair. Ouch. Mr. Wrong stayed with Mr. Right for 1 month, and during that time, he really changed. After 1 week, he was slightly less wrong than he had been before. See, the gloves are all right, but his shoes were still wrong. After 2 weeks, he was even more slightly less wrong than he had been before. The gloves are all right, the shoes are all right. After a whole 4 weeks, which is a month, right, he was a changed Mr. Man. You could hardly tell the difference between him and Mr. Right, don't you agree? That's Mr. Wrong, can you believe that? Right gloves, right shoes, right hat. Mr. Wrong's not wrong anymore. Mr. Right was delighted, very happy. "Told you," he cried. "Told you that everything about you may end up being not quite so absolutely, totally, completely, utterly wrong. In fact, you've really turned out all right. Maybe you should be called Mr. Right now." Mr. Wrong blushed because he was a little bit shy, eh? It was quite the nicest thing anyone had ever said to him in his whole life. And he went home and lived happily and right ever after. Do you think that's the end of the story? Well, it isn't. And the reason it isn't the end of the story is because of what happened to Mr. Right. The trouble was, you see, that the longer Mr. Wrong had stayed with Mr. Right, the more right Mr. Wrong became. And the more wrong Mr. Right had become. So, after living with Mr. Right, Mr. Wrong becomes Mr. Right. But Mr. Right becomes Mr. Wrong. Isn't that extraordinary? Oh dear, my plan didn't quite work out the way I planned it after all. Mr. Right is now wrong. Wrong gloves, wrong side of the hat, wrong shoes. He went to bed. In the bath. Mr. Right went to bed in the bath. Do we sleep in the bathtub? No, really. We don't sleep in the bathtub, right? So that's the end of the story. I hope you've enjoyed that. Until next time, bye.